Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to talk about the impact of imperialism and also those who were opposed and those who were proponents of imperialism. So let's get started. In 1900, Republican William McKinley, a reluctant but confirmed imperialist, and he was pro-imperialism, was elected to a second term. He ran again against William Jennings Bryan, who you already know, and he was staunchly opposed to imperialism. This should give you a sense that, generally speaking, the Republican Party is pro, the Democratic Party is going to be shifting and they will be in opposition, but it's not always true of every candidate. McKinley's reelection confirmed that a majority of Americans favored his policies. Although, if you remember right, this election was super close the first time, and backed by all kinds of powerful magnates. Under McKinley, the United States had gained an empire, and now they were going to keep it. Even before McKinley was reelected, there was an anti-imperialist league that had sprung into being. There were people that were growing in their concern over the United States developing this empire. The league included some of the most prominent people in America, such as the former President Grover Cleveland, industrial leader Andrew Carnegie, who was concerned with labor issues around imperialism. The social worker Jane Addams, you haven't read a lot about, but she's already concerned about the influx of immigrants into our cities and how we are doing with keeping up with supporting a population of people that's new to America. Also, many leading writers who might have had opportunity to look at this from a more moral perspective, so Mark Twain, for example. All agreed that it was wrong for the United States to rule other people without their consent. The novelist Mark Twain questioned the motives for imperialism in a satirical piece written in 1901, and this is what it says in part. "Shall we go on conferring our civilization upon the peoples that sit in darkness, or shall we give those poor things a rest? Extending the blessings of civilization to our brother who sits in darkness has been a good trade and has paid well on the whole, and there is money in it yet, but enough, not enough, in my judgment, to make any considerable risk advisable." As a novelist, Twain had great influence on American culture, but little influence on foreign policy. In the earliest 20th century, the United States, under the control of Teddy Roosevelt in the growing future, and Woodrow Wilson eventually, and newspaper magnates like Hearst and Pulitzer, who are making big money off of it, are going to encourage imperialism. So we're going to talk about America emerging as a world power at the tail end of this imperialist time period. It's also called New Imperialism because it's kind of like industrialization happened 40 years ahead of it happening in the United States, and we were kind of part of a second industrial revolution. Imperialism had happened around the world ahead of the United States, and so some people call this, in late 1890s, the New Imperialism, because it's kind of a second round that the United States gets involved in. All right, so first of all, the assassination of William McKinley. If you'll remember, when we left the Spanish-American War behind, Teddy Roosevelt comes back home. He's quite famous from being leading the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, going off like a splendid little war, right? 4 months, 15 weeks, and it's all over, and he ends up emerging as a hero. Whether he really deserved credit for that or not is something that lots of historians talk about. The bottom line, newspapers played him up, and he came home quite popular. He became governor of New York, and then became vice president of the United States under McKinley. But the assassination of William McKinley in 1901 thrust that vice president, who they had kind of hidden away there, Teddy Roosevelt, into the role of a world leader. Roosevelt was unwilling to allow the imperial powers of Europe to control the world's political and economic destiny. He, just like everything else in his life, he is going to seize control. This political cartoon is called The World's Constable. It says it at the bottom, but I know parts of it are a little bit fuzzy. Over here, you have a big stick. Teddy Roosevelt is famous for saying things like, "Walk softly, but carry a big stick." And I want you to think about what he thinks this big stick represents. Walk softly or speak softly. Some people say he said speak softly and carry a big stick. And over here underneath this arm, it says arbitration. A constable is a police officer. And you can see that his legs are now spanning 2 continents, Europe over here, the Western Hemisphere, and many other nations over here, and that he is somehow kind of bridging the gap between the two, seizing any amount of power that he can. In 1905, building on the open door notes to increase American influence in East Asia, Roosevelt had mediated a settlement in a war between Russia and Japan and had won a Nobel Peace Prize for that, which helped him to gain some notoriety on the global stage. But we are going to spend most of our time talking about Central America and Latin America today. So you can see that here he is with his big stick, still a constable, and he's reaching for Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador and other places in our own hemisphere. Today we're going to be talking about Colombia. If you look at this map, you will see that all of this territory was at this point in history a place called Colombia. Panama as a nation did not exist, and that's part of our story today. So this is all Colombia. There is no Panama until we get involved. Hopefully you can see in this political cartoon a very creepy Uncle Sam in the back. Of all the political cartoons I look at, Uncle Sam creeps me out and haunts me in my nightmares the most from this political cartoon. I mean, good Lord, what is that? But in the foreground you see Teddy Roosevelt, and hopefully you see that he's rather threatening in his behavior toward Colombia. And we'll get more to this point today as well. Away we go with some story. By the time Roosevelt became president, many Americans, including Teddy, who had read Alfred T. Mahan's book, Influence of Sea Power Upon the World, felt that the United States needed a canal cutting across Central America because it would greatly reduce travel time for commercial and military ships, providing a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. As early as 1850, the United States and Britain had agreed to share the rights to such a canal. Now note that we're building this in Central America, but already decades ahead of it being constructed, the United States and Great Britain had agreed to share the rights to a canal in an area that they had no control over. So think about the imperialist attitude there. They're just saying, hey, we'll share the rights to some country to be named later with each other. And of course, there's no conversation with those companies at the time. In something called the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty of 1901, Britain gave the United States exclusive rights to build and control a canal through Central America. They're going to cut back on their own imperialist actions because they're going to need to. Running into some economic troubles. Engineers identified 2 possible routes for a proposed canal zone. There's lots of surveying going on. One ran through Nicaragua. It posed fewer obstacles because much of it was going to make use of a natural lake. But the other route crossed through Panama, which was a province of Colombia at the time. It was shorter, but it was filled with mountains and swamps, and it was going to be a difficult job. In the late 1800s, a French company had previously tried to build a canal in Panama, but after 10 years, the company had given up. It had had so many struggles in the area, and it had gone bankrupt. The company gave up, and it sent an agent. Now that the United States was kind of seeking out a route, it sent an agent named Philippe Bunau-Varilla to Washington, D.C. to convince the United States that maybe it could buy its old claim, meaning it could have all of its old equipment, it could have the rights to all the surveying that had been done, and so it could make use of the work that the French company had already done. So a French agent from the construction company has gone to Washington, D.C. and said, hey, wheelin' and dealin', would you like to buy our old route? It's trying to get out of its economic situation. In 1903, the President and Congress decided to use the Panama route, agreed to buy the French company's plans, its equipment, and everything for about $40 million, and then begins negotiation with Colombia for how this was all going to work. So before beginning work on the Panama Canal, the United States had to get permission from Colombia, which ruled Panama, of course, it's their province, And when these negotiations broke down, Philip Bunalvaria helped organize a rebellion against Colombia. It's in his best interest that this gets sold, right? So that they make some of their money back. So he helps to organize a Panamanian rebellion against Colombia. On November 3rd of 1903, about a dozen U.S. warships end up present in Panama and help the Panamanian people there declare their independence from Colombia. 15 days later, Panama and the United States sign a treaty, and the United States agrees to pay Panama $10 million plus an annual rent of $250,000 for an area of land across Panama called the Canal Zone. The payments were to begin in 1913. Now that the United States is dealing with Panama, by the way, in the cartoon I showed you earlier, the United States had offered Colombia $25 million for the canal route, and Colombia said they thought that they could get a better deal from somebody else. They thought that price was rather low. So they wanted to enter into negotiations, and that's when the United States decided to back the Panamanian rebellion instead, and you can see here that they ended up paying Panama significantly less than $25 million for the rights. And so the United States comes in and seeks to create what the pictures that you're going to be looking at here. So a canal zone, there was a lot of construction that needed to be done, a lot of removal of debris that had to be done. So railroads and heavy construction equipment were brought in. Some of it was used from the old French project, but a lot of it was brought in. Teddy Roosevelt even goes down to the canal zone himself. It's one of the first times a president travels abroad for purposes like this. And there's famous pictures of him on these big giant equipments. This is a dredger. There were places where they needed to make natural waterways deeper, and there are places where they needed to cut through mountains to create pathways in the first place. Construction of the Panama Canal ranks as one of the world's greatest engineering feats. Some people call it a modern wonder of the world. Builders fought diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. Soft volcanic soil that proved really difficult to remove from where it lay caused all kinds of avalanche and, not avalanche I guess for snow, but mudslides and things like that. Lots of people lost their lives in these mudslides that would occur with the soft volcanic soil. Work began in 1904 with the clearing of brush and the draining of swamps. And by 1913, at the height of construction, more than 43,400 workers were employed there. Some had come from Italy and Spain, but most had come from the British West Indies. Initially, there were a number of people that had come from the United States, but they just couldn't hack the tropical climate. They died in overwhelming numbers due to the yellow fever and malaria. But people of the British West Indies had a bit of an immunity built up, and so they were more effective workers. More than 5,600 workers on the canal are going to die from accidents or disease. 5,600. The total cost to the United States was more than $380 million. Upon completion of construction, there were a series of 3 locks, Miraflores, the Pedro Miguel, and the Gatun locks, that were supposed to use gravity to raise and lower ships as they moved through those locks, to move ships from one sea level, the Pacific Ocean's sea level, to this natural lake, the Gatun Lake, which was in the middle section, and then to drop it back down to the Atlantic Ocean sea levels. On August 15th of 1914, the canal would open for business, and more than 1,000 merchant ships would pass through during its first year alone. United States and Latin American relations were damaged by American support of the rebellion in Panama. The resulting ill will last for decades, despite Congress's paying $25 million to Colombia as an apology for its lost territory and compensation.
But there are important differences between the current and the new locks. The new locks have a higher capacity. They are wider, longer, and deeper than the current locks, allowing the transit of larger vessels.
Well, What they're talking about right here is the expansion project of the Panama Canal Zone. Today, the United States controlled it until 1999, when Panama took over.